My name is Braden Green, and I'm going to be doing my presentation over dissociative amnesia. There's some criteria that have to be met in order to be diagnosable. The most obvious symptom of dissociative amnesia is the inability to remember autobiographical events. These are generally stressful or traumatic in nature, and it's inconsistent with normal forgetting. It must cause clinically significant distress, occupationally or personally. It can't be better explained by other dissociative identity or by other dissociative disorders, including dissociative identity disorder. And it cannot be attributable to physiological effects of the substance or neurobiological or otherwise medical condition. As far as diagnostic features are concerned, there's several different kinds of dissociative amnesia. The first one is localized. This is broader than just the traumatic event. So it includes the traumatic event, but it also includes a bigger category of time. Then there's selective amnesia. So this is when the person can recall some, but not all of the event during, once again, a specific period of time. Generalized amnesia is the most rare form of dissociative amnesia, and it's more closely associated with dissociative identity disorder. Generalized amnesia is just a complete loss of memory for one's life history. In rare cases, someone may forget even their personal identity. This usually has an acute onset, and it's more common among combat veterans or sexual assault victims. Systematized amnesia is whenever someone loses their memory for a specific category of time. So someone might forget everything about their childhood or everything about an ongoing abuse that occurred, or they might forget everything about their family. So systematized includes a category of things that is forgotten. Continuous amnesia is whenever an individual forgets each new event as it occurs. It's important to note that individuals with dissociative amnesia usually are unaware of their memory problems, and when they are aware, they have they're more likely to minimize the importance of their memory loss. So dissociative amnesia can be as simple as, well, I wouldn't call it simple, but it can be a suppressed memory. It can be something that was traumatic, and so the person suppressed it as a coping mechanism, or it can be a part of a more involved disorder such as dissociative identity disorder. Okay, so some associated features that support the diagnosis. So people with dissociative amnesia are generally chronically impaired in their ability to form and sustain healthy relationships. People with dissociative amnesia generally have histories of trauma, child abuse, and victimization. And dissociative flashbacks are common. Also, many have a history of self-mutilation, which includes suicide attempts and also high-risk behavior. Depressive and functional neurological symptoms are common. People with dissociative amnesia are more subjective to hypnotism, which is interesting, and they generally have sexual dysfunctions. That's common among people with dissociative amnesia. According to the DSM-5, there's a general prevalence of 12 months. For the development or the etiology behind dissociative amnesia, it's interesting because the different categories warrant different time frames. So generalized amnesia, which again was when you just forget a big chunk of your life and sometimes your identity, that usually has a sudden onset of symptoms that happens quickly. Localized and selective amnesia isn't known as much when the symptoms begin, because generally the person suffering isn't aware that they have memories that have been lost. Localized amnesia, the onset may be delayed for hours, days, or even longer. According to the DSM-5, single episodes may predispose future episodes, and the duration of forgotten events can range from minutes to decades. Some episodes dissolve rapidly after the thread is gone, and others persist for a long time. Some individuals may even gradually remember memories years later. And generally, as the amnesia remits, there's considerable distress. Suicidal behavior, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder are likely to emerge. Dissociative amnesia is more likely to occur in people who have had a greater number of adverse childhood experiences. particularly physical or sexual abuse. Interpersonal violence is also a big indicator of dissociative amnesia. Okay, some functional consequences of dissociative amnesia. So people with generalized dissociative amnesia, when they forget the big chunk of their life and their identity sometimes, people who experience this long term usually have impairment in all aspects of functioning. So even whenever the individual relearns aspects of their life history, their autobiographical memory stays very impaired, generally speaking. Some differential diagnoses. So some of these symptoms overlap a little bit, so I want to talk about the difference between dissociative amnesia and some of the other similar diagnoses. So PTSD. Generally, whenever the amnesia extends beyond the immediate time of the trauma, then a comorbid diagnosis of dissociative amnesia is warranted. Neurocognitive disorders, so that extends beyond autobiographical memory and into more intellectual and cognitive functioning. Substance-related disorders, this is going to sound super obvious, but generally the history of the substance, of the use of the substance, is an indicator that that the amnesia may be more due to the substance use rather than the diagnosis of dissociative amnesia. Some other differential diagnoses is post-traumatic amnesia due to brain injury, seizures, catatonic stupor, normal and age-related changes in memory. Another form of dissociative amnesia is called feigned amnesia, F-E-I-G-N-E-D. This is factitious or malingering. So generally how you can tell this apart is if all of a sudden the symptoms show up and the person happens to be having financial, sexual, or legal problems, or they need to escape something really quick. So that's not 100% the case every time, but it's usually, if these things are present, it's usually a good indicator that it might be more feigned than it is organic. So as far as comorbid diagnoses, usually as dissociative amnesia remits, other symptoms arise, such as rage, shame, guilt, distress, grief, dysphoria, suicidal and homicidal ideation, impulses and acts. So symptoms might meet diagnostic criteria for depressive disorder, adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or adjustment disorder with mixed disturbances of emotion and conduct. So usually as dissociative amnesia wears off and the memories begin to surface, PTSD follows afterwards, and sometimes there's comorbid somatic symptoms, and then it's also stated that many individuals with dissociative amnesia have symptoms that meet diagnostic criteria for a personality disorder, so especially dependent, avoidant, or borderline. So all the information I've given you so far comes from the DSM-5. In my references, you'll find some more articles that I included in my research. One of them was really interesting, and I wanted to share it with you. So a group of researchers got together, and they wanted to see what kind of impact amnesia has on our ability to function in everyday life. So they took a group of individuals with painful experiences from their past, and they induced amnesia through hypnosis so that they could no longer remember these painful memories. And with the hypothesis that they would be able to, when they gave them activities to perform on, that they would perform better if they weren't burdened down with these painful traumatic memories. So of course they had their experimental group and their control group, and the control group also had painful memories, but they could not, or they could remember them. So it actually turned out that the people with the suppressed memories performed significantly worse on their everyday activities, so much so that it was as if they had given them an additional task to work on. So that really goes to show the importance of being able to remember things even whenever they're traumatic. Their explanation of why this occurs is that our bodies produce so much energy to suppress the memory, and we put so much memory into this coping mechanism that there's not enough memory or energy left over to function efficiently on everyday tasks for the most part. And so that was super interesting, I thought, and I wish we had more time to talk about that. But they suggest towards the end of the article that we approach therapy when it comes to people with dissociative amnesia with the question, what does the subject do in order not to remember, rather than what happened to the subject that he cannot remember. So I thought that was a good thing to take note of. In another journal article, I pinpointed some specific biological differences in the majority of people with dissociative amnesia according to this study. Some brain changes include reduction in brain metabolism and more selective alterations primarily in the right temporal frontal cortices. That was the major theme that they found in people with dissociative amnesia. And they did state that some of these brain changes can be reversible, but generally it's only reversible if treatment is successfully administered early on rather than later on down the road. According to this article, also, dissociative amnesia affects both genders roughly equally, and it typically occurs as a single episode. Usually dissociative amnesia is harder to diagnose, and two reasons for that, two main reasons, is that, first of all, the individual generally doesn't know that they have forgotten something, and so sometimes it's hard to pinpoint that there's been trauma. And another reason is that a lot of the symptoms can occur as a form of another dissociative disorder, which also makes it hard to pinpoint. Okay, so some treatments of dissociative amnesia. The first is psychotherapy. This is a broad term that includes several forms of therapy. It's also known as talk therapy, and it's the main treatment for people with dissociative amnesia. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a form of therapy that focuses on changing harmful thoughts, behavior, and feelings. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is super interesting. It's where the therapist asks a series of questions during a specific time frame, and they move their hands in a way that triggers the same cycle or the same part of the brain that is stimulated during the REM cycle of sleep, so it's supposed to bring out some of these suppressed memories. Dialectic behavior therapy. So this is generally for people with severe personality disturbances, and it usually takes place after the person has suffered abuse or trauma. Family therapy, its main focus is to teach the family about the disorder and help them recognize the symptoms. Creative therapies like art therapy or music therapy is great for the client to explore and express feelings and thoughts. Meditation and relaxation strategies. Clinical hypnosis. So this is an intense relaxation and concentration and focused attention to achieve a different state of consciousness. This allows people to explore thoughts, feelings, and memories that may be hidden from their conscious minds. And as far as medication is concerned, there's no medication to treat dissociative disorders. However, there is plenty of medicine to treat some of the differential diagnoses or comorbid diagnoses that go along with dissociative disorder. So that is all that I have on dissociative amnesia. Actually, I have a lot more, but I had to cut it down because it was almost 20 minutes. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. If I don't know the answer, I'd be glad to research it. And I hope this was helpful.